Hey there, this is Mr. George, and this is Web Lecture 6.1. Last class we talked a little bit about where the laws that we have in the United States come from, and so now we're going to talk specifically about the different types of laws that we have in the United States. And as you can see here, we have constitutional law, administrative law, statutory law, common law, criminal law, and civil law. So let's talk about all these different types of laws and we'll get some examples of each. So let's begin. The first type of law that we're going to talk about is constitutional law. Now, constitutional law is based on the requirements of the U.S. Constitution and state constitution. So whatever is written in the Constitution, whether it's the federal Constitution or the state Constitution, this is what is established by constitutional law. Now, these constitutional laws are then interpreted by the judicial system, and so that is where you get the differentiation and how you determine whether a constitutional law is just or not. And so when we're thinking about constitutional laws, we're thinking about things that are specifically written in the Constitution, as I said, whether it's the federal Constitution or the state constitutions. So an example of a constitutional law would be the power to raise and collect taxes. So it is specifically written in the Constitution that the federal government, and in certain states, the state government, has the ability to raise and collect taxes. Now, in the federal Constitution, it talks about income tax specifically. However, in state constitutions, some states have income tax, other states just have sales tax, and so those are constitutional laws, and those are given to the state or the federal government depending upon their constitution. Now, the next type of law we're going to talk about is an administrative law. Now, administrative law is a little bit different than a typical law that we might think of, because this is a law that is based on a local, state, or federal agency, or sometimes it is the governor or the president that creates these type of laws. But typically it's the independent agencies in the federal government or in a state government. So when we're talking about individual agencies, we're talking about the Federal Trade Commission or the Aviation Administration, the Federal Aviation Administration. Maybe we're talking about the Food and Drug Administration. So these are these independent agencies that create these laws. So an example of a sort of more local version of that is the food temperature laws. So certain foods have to be stored at certain temperatures or kept at certain temperatures. And this is an administrative law. Now, the Food and Drug Administration does not specifically have Food and Drug Administration police that are going to come and shut down your establishment if you do not follow these laws. But what they will do is give you certain grades. So, if you're not meeting the appropriate food temperature laws or following those laws, then they can give you a lower grade. And if upon re-inspection you still don't, then they can shut you down. So, as I said, there's not a police force determining these laws or policing these laws, but they do have agents that do make sure that you're following the laws. The next type of law is a statutory law. Now, this is the kind of law that we typically think of when we're thinking of laws that people break, because statutory laws are actually written laws. So, as we talked about before, when we're talking about state government, a statute is a state law. So these are laws passed by legislatures. And typically, when we talk about statutory laws, we're talking about the laws that are written by state legislatures. So, and each state has different laws and has the ability to pass different laws. So different examples of statutory laws will be things like speed limits, seatbelt laws, things of that nature. And so these are determined state by state. So these are statutory laws. And statutory laws are enforced by the police, because obviously if you're speeding, they're going to stop you and give you a citation, or if you don't have a seatbelt on, they will do the same thing. So these are statutory laws. Next type of law is common law. Now, common law is kind of tricky because common law isn't written down necessarily, and common law is not something that maybe every police officer knows about, but the idea of common law is these are unwritten laws, and they're the outcome of maybe a previous case, or sometimes it's just sort of the general expectation of how people should behave. But the thing about common law is you cannot create a common law that conflicts with some sort of written law. And these common laws are defined by individual judges. Again, it's based on specific cases. So, for example, my professor in college, he and his friends went to Florida for spring break, and this is a long time ago. And they had a room that was several floors up, and they decided they were going to take their fishing poles and use bait fish to hang them out the window to try to catch pelicans. Well, as they're fishing, quote-unquote fishing for these pelicans, a pelican flies by, sees a fish hanging in the air, goes after it, grabs it, and pulls out the line of the fishing pole, but is caught on the hook, and gets caught and then smacks into the side of the building, falls down, creates a huge commotion, and they get arrested for, this quote-unquote fishing. Well, there had never been a law, per se, based on not fishing for pelicans off a balcony, but because these guys did this, that became a common law. So if you go to Florida, don't try to fish for pelicans off your balcony. You will get arrested, because not only is this sort of a general expectation of how people should behave, you probably shouldn't do that. Also, now that they were arrested and there was a judgment based on that, now this is a common law. So there's common law, for example, another example of common law would be that you cannot ride a horse in the South Park Mall. Nobody's ever tried to do that, but again, that's sort of a reasonable expectations of what human beings should or should not do. They would not let you do that in the South Park Mall. The next type of law we're talking about is criminal law. Now, with criminal law, we're basically talking about laws that are based on public wrongdoing. So if you're doing something against the government, against the state, against other individuals, these are criminal laws. And these are the type of laws that are enforced by the police, by the FBI, by law enforcement agencies. And so a criminal law is any time that you violate the law and commit a crime. An example of that would be rape, murder, arson. Any time that you are violating somebody else's rights, typically this is a criminal law. And then the last type of law we're going to talk about here today is a civil law. Now, civil law is tricky because it's not specifically really even an enforceable law. This is just a law that's based on the conduct and disputes between private parties. So as we talked about the difference between a civil case and a criminal case, this civil law is based on those civil cases. Now, there is a type of law that is called civil law also that is not just based on disputes between parties, and that's the law that affects the legal status of individuals. So if you are in our country without documents or with expired documentation, then you are violating this civil law. So that's also a different type of civil law. But typically when we're talking about civil laws, we're talking about those disputes between private parties. And so we're talking about things like wills, property disputes, divorce, things of that nature. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about civil laws. So this has just been a brief sort of summary of the different types of laws that we have in the United States. And during class, we'll go over specifically more different types of laws and how they impact us in our society. Thanks. Have a great night.